On August 16, 1953, Colonel Nasiri of the Imperial Guard of Iran hand-delivered a signed memo written by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the King of Iran. The recipient was Iran's Prime Minister of barely 2 years, Mohammad Mossadegh. The memo was designed to inform Mossadegh of his formal dismissal as Prime Minister by the Shah of Iran. If you've heard this story before, you've probably heard a familiar retelling of it. The United States government, with the help of the British MI6, launched a coup against the democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh in order to install the tyrannical Shah so that the two nations could secure cheap and easy access to Iranian oil. The problem with this retelling is that it is a gargantuan simplification of an insanely complicated series of interconnected events, and like any game of telephone passing ears, facts become mangled. This story is just another of the lies we tell ourselves. So what's wrong? For starters, the plot did not remove Mossadegh. In fact, one could scarcely call it a plot in the first place. Elements of the plot included lobbying the Shah's sister, waging a propaganda campaign which asserted that Mossadegh was secretly Jewish, and the British exaggerating how many provocateurs they had. The Shah was not installed by the United States or Great Britain in 1953. The ruling Shah had been in power since 1941. It would likewise be a travesty to call Mossadegh democratically elected, given that his position was owed to an appointment by the Shah and an approval by a parliament composed of feudal landowners. Mossadegh was simply never voted on or elected by the people. The United States was also not really concerned about oil. In fact, they wanted Iranian oil to be secured for the Iranian people. Their issue was containing the Soviet Union. Furthermore, Mossadegh had more to do with Mossadegh losing power than any of the forces being mentioned. The tale of the 1953 coup in Iran overemphasizes how competent the West is, underemphasizes how corrupt Mossadegh was, and outright robs the Iranian clergy of any responsibility. History is complicated, and simple narratives underserve the truth. So, what really happened? On August 16, 1953, Colonel Nasiri of the Imperial Guard delivered a decree by Iran's Shah dismissing Mossadegh from his position. This is where the story of Iran's fateful coup begins its separation from history. To start with, we must discuss this man, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi of Iran. We must discuss how he was tested, who he was tested by, and how he overcame his tribulations. Our story starts during World War II. Iran had been under Allied occupation during the course of the war with a formal commitment to leave months after the war's end. The Soviet Union defied this commitment. Iranian railways had been used to supply the Soviet Union during their fight against Nazi Germany, so their occupation of northern Iran had long been established during the war. Though they had agreed to withdraw 6 months after the war's end, the Soviet Union instead opted to sponsor pro-communist separatist governments in Iranian Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, and backing those separations was the Communist Two-Day Party of Iran. The Azerbaijan Democratic Party declared themselves independent of Tehran. They disarmed and occupied the military barracks and forts of the Imperial Iranian Army. The Two-Day Party of Azerbaijan dissolved to join the Azerbaijani Democratic Party. In Iranian Kurdistan, the Republic of Mahabad was likewise created, sponsored, and supported by the Soviet Union. The Mahabad Peshmerga engaged in several ambush attacks with Iran, and had done so under the blanket protection of the Soviet Union. To reiterate this point, Joseph Stalin committed to leaving Iran within 6 months of the war's end, and was instead sponsoring, arming, and training separatist movements within Iran with the intent to establish a Soviet satellite state, which kicked off the Iranian crisis of 1946. These acts resulted in full-blown combat by the Soviet-backed forces in the Iranian military, resulting in eventual Iranian victory and the dissolution of the Soviet-backed republics. Soviet backing kept these nations alive until a US-sponsored resolution within the United Nations Security Council forced the Soviet Union to leave Iran. The Red Army subsequently withdrew from Iran in 1946, but the aspirations for ending the Shah's rule did not subside. In 1949, a member of the Two-Day Party made an assassination attempt against the Shah, shooting him in the face and in the back, but failed to kill the Shah. Despite this, the Shah's early rule was not defined by barbaric brutality or despotism. The Shah seemed to reject the heavy-handed diplomacy of his father and was himself far more reserved and muted in his affairs. At 32 years old at the time of the crisis, it was the opinion of virtually all actors involved in this affair that the ruling Shah was little more than an empty suit, content to let events play out and too timid to challenge any of the players. Think of him as Tommen Baratheon. Minister Abbas Gossein, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, I am an American, signed a contract with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, increasing Iran's share of the oil. To formally adopt this agreement, the support of the Iranian parliament, called the Majlis, would have to be secured. Politics then, as it does now, often complicates things. The Iranian parliament would be required to ratify the agreement, but hardliners insisted on a better stake for Iranian oil. Shah Pahlavi, like his father, was a nationalist who agreed, though no voice was louder than that of the National Front. Haj Razmada, again I'm an American, forgive me, was elected by the parliament to be the prime minister on a mandate to resolve the oil dispute, though he exhibited little confidence in his own abilities to do so. To him, Iran was simply not technically capable of exploring, extracting, refining, or exporting petroleum, leaving the deal with the British to be the most attractive option. Specifically, the agreement would have promised royalty payments to Iran of at least £4 million, reduce the areas available for drilling, and offer training to Iranian workers for administrative jobs. Razmada requested the allowance of Iranian auditors and advancements on royalty payments. This compromising stance clashed with a fellow parliamentarian hardliner by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh was a populist nationalist who stood opposed to the deal with the British. He, like many others, wished to nationalize Iranian oil. In his frustration at Iran's continued capitulation to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company demonstrated the angered temperament Mossadegh would become known for. Mossadegh once threatened Prime Minister Razmada's life in the halls of Parliament.
God is witness, even if we are killed, even if we are shredded into threads, we shall not submit to the rule of such a person. We shall shed blood, and we shall spill blood. If you are a soldier, I am more militant. I will kill you right here.
Mossadegh, being of royal blood, was insulted in kind by the Prime Minister, who remarked that Mossadegh had done little for the poor despite his position. Haj Razmada was only 49 years old when he died. He was assassinated at a mosque by a member of Fidya-e-Islam, a Shia fundamentalist group. Though they may seem unnatural allies, Mossadegh's National Front and Fidya-e-Islam found common cause in their opposition to Haj Razmada. Members of Mossadegh's political circles, such as Foreign Minister Saeed Hussein Fatemi, celebrated the slaying of the former Prime Minister publicly, boasting that selfless militant youth were removing the stains of disgrace. Mossadegh ascended to the rank of Prime Minister following the assassination of Razmada, and used his powers as Prime Minister to undermine the Shah, take over military powers, dissolve the Supreme Court, and utilize armed thugs to crack down on critical media. One of the first acts of Mossadegh and his allies was to officially pardon the assassin who killed Haj Razmada and release him from custody. Mossadegh argued that Razmada had committed treason against Iran, justifying his assassination at the hands of an Islamic extremist group. Furthermore, the assassin's livelihood was mandated by law. Once he was free, the Iranian taxpayer would pay for the assassin's bills. Oil is something of a red herring to this story. It was the nationalist fury over oil which saw Mossadegh's rise to power, and his populism carried his support into being prime minister. That Iran should control her own oil was not really that controversial, both within and outside of Iran. Even the Shah favored nationalizing the oil industry. Mossadegh took everything a step further though, rejecting negotiations with the British and seizing British oil assets. Mossadegh then deported British oil workers from Iran, causing a total shutdown of Iran's oil industry and international sanctions against the country. It was this stunt which involved the United States into the dispute. Mossadegh was intransigent, going so far as to reject a 50-50 share split with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Simply put, Mossadegh isolated Iranian oil from the world, bringing ruin to their economy. A recession and currency devaluation plagued the Iranian economy as a result, causing Mossadegh to play monopoly money in desperation. He printed money, and I don't have to tell you, this is always a bad idea. He did so without the say-so of the Iranian parliament, and without consultation from the National Bank. Shockingly, printing money did not fix the issue. It simply caused inflation. Mossadegh's National Front, a coalition of support in parliament, also began to crack under the pressure. The clerical faction of Iran, led by Ayatollah Bojardi, became increasingly disillusioned with Mossadegh's plan for land redistribution, the political enfranchisement of women, and prospects of modernizing Iran, despite presenting a united front on nationalizing oil. This fact was noted by Ambassador to Iran, Loy Henderson, in a telegram to the State Department, where he noted,
"During the last 6 months, there has been a sharp shift in basic Mossadegh support among political leaders. Most elements of the original National Front movement are now in open or tacit opposition. Mossadegh's support now appears largely to rest on security forces, which he tells me he does not trust. Government bureaucracy, including newly appointed governors general whose loyalty is untested, government monopoly of radio, and variety groups and individuals with widely divergent interests. When it serves the party's interests, Tudeh also rallies to his support in times of strain. Nevertheless, his failure to solve the oil problem in ways economically advantageous to Iran, economic deterioration of the country, his frequent use of mass demonstrations in order to bring pressure on opposition, his inability to obtain cooperation from outstanding political leaders in the country, and his resort to military law to maintain order have served to weaken his popularity, even among the masses."
To put it simply, Iran was in a state of disarray. Mossadegh wielded the powers of government like a curious 10-year-old with a gun. He was reckless, and he challenged Iran's entire system of constitutional order. Before Operation Ajax ever existed, the CIA learned of an internal Iranian plot to replace Mossadegh. By this point, even the Shah had grown weary of Mossadegh. According to CIA documents, the Shah backed the ascension of Fazlullah Zahedi to be the new prime minister, but wished to resolve Mossadegh's term through parliament. Shah Pahlavi did not favor directly dismissing Mossadegh from power, as he had believed that the British favored retaining Mossadegh to undermine the power of the Shah. By this point, Zahedi had dropped his coup plot in favor of the Shah's plan to let the events ride out, as Mossadegh was growing increasingly isolated and unpopular. Leading clerics were uniting in a mutual desire to bolster the Shah's position out of convenience. Operation Ajax was led by Kermit Roosevelt, though the plot scarcely had any real details. In a March 1953 memo, the CIA outlined the resources they had to oppose Mossadegh, which ranged from,
"The CIA presently has no group which would be effective in spreading anti-Mossadegh propaganda. Gossip will be so ineffective as to make it not worth considering. The CIA has no group in Iran which could effectively promote riots demonstrating against Mossadegh, and tribal leaders are pro-Mossadegh and rather anti-Shah."
If this was the CIA plot against Mossadegh, it's amazing how it went from impotent to outright regime change in a matter of months. That propaganda campaigns were waged against Mossadegh is undeniable. That Mossadegh's downfall was that people thought he was a secret Jew because of the United States is, frankly, laughable. It's at this time that we cover a few more erroneous misconceptions before continuing. It was not the British who asked the United States to intervene in the interest of oil. It was the Iranians, much to the anguish of the British. Mossadegh himself requested American mediation in negotiations, believing America to be a strong supporter of freedom. Despite this, he rejected all initiatives offered by American diplomats, including a deal he had privately agreed to in which Iran's oil fields would be owned by Iran but operated by international oil companies on Iran's behalf, with compensation deals providing Iran money from the leases and a chance for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to purchase Iranian oil. American deals caused tensions with the British, who believed that America should be more supportive considering their previous alliance and ongoing assistance during the Korean War. Despite British disappointment, Mossadegh walked away from a deal he had agreed to in order to advance his own political legacy. Mossadegh was not concerned with securing oil. He was interested in securing his own political standing.
Don't you realize that returning to Iran empty-handed, I return in a much stronger position than if I returned with an agreement which I would have to sell to my fanatics?
With the collapse of the Iranian economy, the fracturing of the National Front, both the British and Americans beginning to work to undermine him for his intransigence, and the Iranian cleric opposing him, Mossadegh's desperation only grew. In what was an undoubtedly illegitimate referendum, Mossadegh dissolved the parliament. The referendum was 2 million votes in favor of doing so and 1,000 votes against. This move angered the Speaker of the Majlis, Ayatollah Kashani, who mobilized street protests against the Prime Minister. This course of action shifted America's tone regarding regime change against Mossadegh. Ambassador Loy Henderson treated Iranian appeals for help against Mossadegh as Iranian problems to be dealt with by the Iranian people. But by 1953, Washington shifted due to fear of the Communist Two-Day Party taking over the country. Hilariously, Mossadegh attempted to use this fear of a communist takeover to extort the United States into purchasing Iranian oil, urging that a communist revolution would sweep the nation. This was the impetus behind Operation Ajax. The National Assembly was likely to dismiss Mossadegh, causing his brash move to dissolve the parliament. The Iranian Prime Minister had no such authority to dissolve parliament. Further, Mossadegh was advised against this move by advisors and allies who saw the move as usurping the long-held power of the Shah to dismiss or replace prime ministers. Prime Minister Mossadegh was warned by his close friend Karim Samjabi that dissolving parliament might incite a reaction from the Shah or even incite a coup. Mossadegh dismissed these concerns, claiming that the Shah did not have the courage to dismiss him, and that he had the people's unconditional support to protect him from a coup. Mossadegh had acted without approval from either the parliament or the Shah when he held his referendum, seemingly exercising a very naked power grab. The Shah had limited military authority to intervene, as the Prime Minister had isolated the Shah from his own officers when he exercised a takeover of the Ministry of War. Mossadegh was, at one point, dismissed by the Shah and replaced by Prime Minister Kavam, but a 2-day lead street battle that killed 69 people and injured 250 led to a populist reinstatement of Mossadegh over the Shah's wishes. The Majlis reappointed him. This event lost Mossadegh much of the conservative support from the National Front and gave the 2-day, as, at minimum, a street alliance. The Prime Minister then used emergency powers to effectively dissolve the nation's Supreme Court, and officers in the Iranian military were purged except for pro-Mossadegh nationalists who were promoted. By 1951, Mossadegh was effectively in control of both the police and the military. Power had been centralized on him and his loyalists, and mobs of 2-day party communists had intimidated the government into keeping Mossadegh in power. This was, however, a house of cards. Mossadegh had left Iran in economic shambles with an inflationary recession. He had dissolved the nation's Supreme Court, dissolved the nation's parliament through a bogus referendum not approved by the Shah, all while using street thugs to silence opposition. A quiet coup had been brewing for months by Fazollah Sehedi, only to be suppressed by the Shah, who had not wished to intervene against Mossadegh. But the day finally came. On August 16, 1953, Colonel Nasiri of the Imperial Guard hand-delivered a signed memo written by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the King of Iran. The recipient was Iran's Prime Minister of barely 2 years, Mohammad Mossadegh. The memo was designed to inform Mossadegh of his formal dismissal as Prime Minister by the Shah of Iran. Mossadegh ordered his guards to take the order from Nasiri and bring it to him. He then offered a written response.
I received Your Majesty's correspondence at 1 o'clock in the morning on August 16, 1953. Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh.
He then ordered the arrest of Nasiri. The Shah had ordered the dismissal of Mossadegh and the appointment of Sehedi, but when he hadn't received a response from Nasiri, the Shah realized that Mossadegh was not going to step down in what Kermit Roosevelt referred to as a counter-coup. The Shah then fled with his wife in a small aircraft to Baghdad, where he stayed only for a day before fleeing to Italy. Mossadegh provided instructions to General Riahi, the Army Chief of Staff, informing him of the decree. He had requested a radio to broadcast the final message, but rather than broadcast this message, Mossadegh instead insisted on remaining in power as the ruler of Iran. An agreement was struck amongst the Prime Minister's loyalists that the Shah's order be hidden from the public. The radio would broadcast a statement announcing that a coup was orchestrated by the Imperial Guard against Mossadegh, but that it had failed, leaving Mossadegh in full control of the government. This caused a schism, with some urging a declaration to the people that the Shah was a traitor, and thus they implored Mossadegh to establish a new republic government. Hussein Fatemi rallied the 2-day party demonstrations against the Shah. Hussein Fatemi urged Mossadegh to arm members of the 2-day party to maximize manpower and use lethal force to secure this new republic. As Mossadegh's foreign minister at the time, Fatemi urged Italy and Iraq that the Shah should be treated as a deposed king. On his orders, photographs of the Shah were removed from government buildings. Though Mossadegh regarded the establishment of a republic as essentially handing over the country to the communist 2-day party, he had little will to intervene against them. Iranian clerics regarded this move with suspicion, as the establishment of Iran as a republic would, in their eyes, invite annexation by the Soviet Union. The military was largely under the control of Mossadegh, and Tehran had isolated Mossadegh's only remaining threat, General Zahedi. While it appeared all but certain that Mossadegh had successfully achieved absolute power due to the Shah fleeing to Italy and Zahedi reduced to hiding in CIA safe houses, a major gambit had long been at play. General Zahedi made thousands of copies of the Shah's order which appointed him as the new prime minister, and dismissed Mossadegh. These thousands of copies were distributed to the public, catching the attention of bazaarists and clergy, who immediately notified Grand Ayatollah Hussein Boroujerdi, Iran's most prominent Shia cleric. The Ayatollahs were in no way fond of the prospect of two-day rule or Soviet annexation, and so thought it imperative to support the constitutional monarchy of the Shah. Boroujerdi therefore endorsed General Zahedi as the prime minister, and called for protests and rallies to support this. Ayatollah Koshani likewise rallied street protests in fear of a communist takeover of Iran. Government offices were seized by the crowds, and military officers in Tehran refused to recognize or obey orders from Mossadegh, and any allegiance with the new deposed prime minister would mean armed conflict with fellow servicemen who were loyal to Shah Pahlavi, a conflict none of the officers wanted due to their own weirdness with Mossadegh and their own anxieties about two-day rule in Iran. Mossadegh was protected only by the guards of his own residence. When crowds of civilians gathered around Mossadegh's residence in Tehran to seize the main base of the government, guards opened fire, killing 40. By 4:30 p.m., August 19th, Mossadegh required a lien for safety. Brigadier General Nasratollah Fuladvand advised Mossadegh that it was over. No amount of fighting would keep him in power. It would only shed more blood. Mossadegh agreed, hung a white sheet for his surrender over his window, and then fled his home. Just like that, the crisis came to an end a mere 3 days after it had started. The chaos which allowed Mossadegh to consolidate power acted as a conduit for Zahedi to take office of prime minister from him. Opposition to Mossadegh strengthened the Iranian clergy, making an unusual alliance between the modernist Shah and the conservative Ayatollahs. The Shah, once in exile from his own country, was now reinstated. Fears of two-day party control of Iran worked in America's favor. Kermit Roosevelt was able to claim credit in the chaos with the claim that he resalvaged an American operation to bring an end to Mossadegh, something we now know isn't true, but who could prove the enterprising Roosevelt wrong then? Shockingly, the CIA station in Tehran did more to undermine Roosevelt's claim than any of the actors within Iran when they wrote that the royalist pro-Zahedi movement of August 19th contained a large element of spontaneity, and there seemed to have been a genuine reaction of shock and dismay on part of the Tehran population when the Shah left Iran for Iraq. Though bombastic, Mossadegh's term opened up many opportunities for different groups to strengthen their own positions, and those who gained the most would work to continue to outmaneuver others until the 1979 revolution, when the clerics took over Iran and dissolved its former government. There were two coups in Iran in 1953. One was Mossadegh defying a written dismissal and seizing power for himself. The other was the clergy shepherding support for General Zahedi to become prime minister. The United States was largely ineffective, despite taking credit for the operation which ended the Mossadegh regime. Regardless of what the United States did, Mossadegh was going to fall. Though Roosevelt would like to take credit for his fall, the U.S. State Department offered a much grimmer outlook on the situation when Mossadegh launched his coup attempt.
The move failed. Actually, it was a counter-coup, as the Shah acted within his constitutional power in signaling the decree replacing Mossadegh. The old boy wouldn't accept this, and arrested the messenger and everybody else involved that he could get his hands on. We now have to take a whole new look at the Iranian situation, and probably have to snuggle up to Mossadegh if we are going to save anything there.
General Zahedi, as prime minister, offered Mossadegh safe custody and respect. Officers were disallowed to act in any way against Mossadegh which would have been considered inappropriate or abusive. Zahedi, as general, wielded this power of command. When Mossadegh surrendered, he was greeted by a military salute and then placed under arrest. Mossadegh was then tried for defying the Shah for a 3-day period after his dismissal. Mossadegh was sentenced to 3 years in a private prison in a military barrack before being exiled to his home village, where he stayed until his death in 1967. Hussein Fatemi was tried, tortured, and executed by firing squad for treason. Abdullah Ali Khan, Mossadegh's Minister of Justice, was beaten to death by a mob following the coup attempt. The Iranian economy was still in tattered conditions, forcing the nation to sign the Consortium Agreement of 1954, which granted international oil companies 50% share ownership over Iranian oil production. This event has painted some egregiously misleading pictures, specifically about how nefarious the United States was, how democratic Iran was, how innocent Mossadegh was, and how little the clergy was involved. In a simplified picture, the great empires of the United States and Great Britain deposed a democratically elected leader who wanted to share oil profits with the people and replaced him with a despotic dictator. This picture is wrong. It robs the Iranian people of agency, it overplays what the United States did, and it severely underplays what Mossadegh did. No person is more responsible for the downfall of Mossadegh than Mossadegh himself, and his intransigence and bullheadedness ruined the lives of the people he killed, their families, his staff who were executed as traitors, and his own legacy as a well-regarded leader was tarnished following his coup attempt. Everything that happened is happening to the backdrop of a very real threat from the Soviet Union to fund, annex, or support two-day independence movements in Iran. A child king survived an assassination attempt by the communists of Iran. Islamic extremists assassinated prime ministers only to be pardoned by their successors. Oil assets were blindly seized without cause, very rapidly dwindling the Iranian people's economic well-being. The Shah was weak, the United States was incompetent, Mossadegh was bullheaded, the clergy was scared shitless, and, despite all of this, the whole situation is framed as if the United States was working the Iranian people like a bunch of sock puppets. The truth is way more complicated than that. The Shah enjoyed dwindling support, especially after announcing in 1973 that the oil agreement with the United States would not be renewed, losing him Western backing and isolating him as he increasingly antagonized the Iranian clergy. In 1979, Shah Pahlavi was deposed as king, and Iran was reborn again. Not as a communist republic, but as an Islamic theocracy. Ayatollah Khomeini served as Iran's first supreme leader. The Shah died in exile in Egypt a year later, and the rest is history.